Hello, my name is Harry Forsdick. I live in Lexington. I've lived here for 41 years. Today, I'd like to tell you the story about my grandfather, Captain John Clark. Uh, Actually, my full name is Harry Clark Forsdick, and both of us have an E on the end of the Clark, as the Lexington Clarks have. I never knew my grandfather. He was born in 1876 and died in 1946, so he died when he was 70. Died a year before I was born. Although I never knew him, he was certainly a legendary figure in our family. My mother was the middle of five children, two brothers and two sisters. And she was born in England in 1913. They emigrated to the United States in 1920, but I'll tell more about that later. My grandfather was a captain of merchant marine ships, basically transporting foodstuffs across the Atlantic, mostly fruit, from South America to England first, and then when they emigrated to the United States in 1920, from South America to New York. My grandfather was a somewhat mythical figure, certainly because I never knew him and heard a lot of stories about him, but he was also had the position and filled it well of being captain. So he would be away on for long periods of time, like 5 months or 3 months, something like that. And then I think he would be home for substantial periods of time. So the period I'm going to talk about is his life from 1914 through 1918 during the war, in which he traveled many different places and some amount in the beginning to the United States. Most of what he did during the war was captain of a merchant marine ship, transporting foodstuffs from various points in the European theater. When war broke out in 1914, he was en route on a ship from Rotterdam to Jamaica, and when he reached Jamaica, he received communications from his company telling him to proceed to Honduras and then to New York, and then finally from New York to Marseille. When he got to Marseille, that was the start of his involvement in the war. For most of the time until he was captured, he was transporting food from various spots in the European theater. But sometimes he was actually in charge of port operations in terms of loading and unloading ships. One time when he was in Gothenburg, Sweden, he was arrested as a British spy, but managed, after being interviewed, to convince them that he was not a British spy, and indeed he was not. One of the fortunate things for me is that I have a complete account of his 4 or 5 years, from 14 to 18, of what he did, that he wrote himself. And I will intersperse this interview with me reading from his, if you will, diary of that account. You'll be able to tell the difference because I have a red shirt on when it's me, and I have a blue striped shirt on when I'm talking his words. So everything was going along normally until he was returning one night, an empty ship en route to Liverpool, and two German subs were spotted surveilling them. And I'll let him tell the story about that. We continued these runs until December 1915. I was en route to Liverpool on an empty ship without convoy, passing the Smalls Lighthouse at the entrance to the Bristol Channel, when we sighted two submarines, and they put up signals ordering us to stop. We didn't stop, but tried to run away across the channel to the Irish side, doing everything possible to outwit the submarines. Only one of the subs gave chase, and since she had a little more speed than we did, she gradually overtook us. This was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and getting dark. She got within range and started firing her guns. The sub was on the surface all the time. Started shelling us, and she eventually got the range and put the shell over the bridge right alongside where I was standing and blew apart part of the bridge. In the next 2 or 3 shots, she had the rudder. It was now getting quite dark. If it had gotten dark a little sooner, we would have gotten away. When the rudder got out of commission, I had to turn around and look at her. Had to give in then. She was then only 200 to 300 yards astern of us. She got into position to fire a torpedo, and we abandoned ship. The crew were all away, and just as the last boat was getting away, she fired a torpedo, which went right under the boat I was in and hit the ship right in the engine room. There were 2 boys who had been lowering the lifeboats, and they were blown to smithereens. Fortunately, my lifeboat didn't capsize. It was then dark, and so it happened that just about that time a Belgian trawler came along, and we went toward it and got aboard. As we got aboard, the submarine came around to have a look at the ship, Van Steerum, and she fired a couple of shots into her and went away, seeing the ship was doomed. We decided to go on since we had saved all the crew except the 2 boys who were blown up, and we went to Milford Haven. So after some time of rest and relaxation back home, he went out again. And just to summarize what's in this diary of his, there were times when he was in the Mediterranean, when he was being hassled by German U-boats and evading them. Then there was one more serious time, which essentially was the remainder of his involvement in the war. And I'll let him tell the stories about that himself. On October 2nd, 1916, I was on the voyage from St. Louis de Rhone to Salonika when I was torpedoed without warning in the Aegean Sea off the island of Skyros. The ship sank in 20 minutes. We left the ship just before she sank and found after leaving that the mate had been left behind. He appeared just as the ship was going down, stem first, and he jumped into the water and was saved by holding onto a grating. After the ship went down, the submarine came alongside the boats and called for the captain. As I had my uniform on, I was compelled to submit, especially as the officers of the submarine drew their revolvers and commenced to fire across the bows of the boat in which I was. I went on board the submarine, and she immediately submerged as there was a vessel which proved to be a British destroyer coming towards us. The submarine proved to be the U-46, a small vessel which was 8 days from Pula in the Adriatic and was bound for the Black Sea. As word was quickly flashed to the naval base in Maduros that a submarine was in the vicinity, a number of patrol boats were ordered out to look for the submarine. The U-boat had a very small radius underwater, having only storage capacity for about 35 hours for her electric motors. She came up at about 10 p.m. the next night, October 3rd, but had to submerge almost immediately on account of a number of patrol boats being sighted. She came up again during the night, but had to submerge again in a few hours without having charged her batteries sufficiently. The U-boat came up in the Gulf of Flandria, a long, narrow bay at the head of the Aegean Sea, where she was apparently trapped. The crew of the U-boat consisted of 18 men, 4 officers, including the commander, and 14 seamen. All of the officers could speak English. The accommodations were very limited. There were only 2 berths for the officers, and when one was on duty, the other turned into his berth. The seamen had no definite place to sleep and slung their hammocks anywhere a place could be found. I slept on top of the electric storage batteries in the forward end of the boat and had to turn out whenever one of the seamen wanted my place or the batteries were being charged. There was very little food on the boat, she having been at sea so long, and I was given a small bowl of noodle soup and a piece of black bread each day. I was on board 10 days, and this ration was cut down after 8 days. Until on arrival, we had nothing on board except a few cans of sardines. On the 11th day, after many narrow escapes when attempting to charge our batteries at night, they decided to try and break out of the Gulf, and they were successful in coming up about midnight in the Gulf of Salonika. When we broke the surface, a large French hospital ship was seen close to. This vessel was completely lighted up with a large red cross on each side and forward. The U-boat promptly submerged, and the commander called me into the control room to look through the periscope at the ship he was going to sink. It having recently been given out that the Germans would sink hospital ships on sight because they were carrying munitions. This ship could not be engaged in any illegal traffic because she was outward bound from Salonika. This I explained to the commander and also told him that I would report the matter if I ever got back to England. He flew into a rage when I told him this and ordered me back to where I came from. However, he did not torpedo the ship, although the crew was at quarters ready, and he allowed her to proceed without molestation. At about this time, my wife was notified by the British Admiralty that the submarine had been destroyed and me with her. The next night, the U-boat sneaked under the lee of the island of Imrose and reached a rendezvous on the Gallipoli Peninsula, where a German officer came on board to pilot us through the minefields at the entrance of the Dardanelles. After getting underway and passing through the minefields at the entrance, we continued on the surface to Constantinople. He then continues to describe a route to his eventual POW camp for British officers, including descriptions of various schemes and attempts at escape. A lot of these stories are reminiscent of the 1960s sitcom Hogan's Heroes, with lots of mistakes by the German guards and a cleverness, naturally, of the British officers to outwit them. Early in 1970, we received orders to move, and 750 British officers were entrained to an unknown destination. We arrived at a small village near to the camp to which we were going. The camp was at Augustabad in Mecklenburg. The camp was an abandoned Jura hotel and was a very beautiful situation on the shores of a lake. This was the best camp I was in during my years in Germany. It was entirely given over to the British, and during the 9 months I was there, I really had a very good time. This kind of life soon got monotonous, and we started devising means of escape. The tradesmen were allowed to come into the camp, and we were allowed to buy almost anything. We had several civil engineers in the camp, and they devised a plan to dig a tunnel out of the camp where there was a large bureau in the dining room with a large empty basement underneath. It was planned to cut a hole in the floor of the dining room inside the bureau to get down to the basement and dig the tunnel from there. 4 men worked at a time, and we had a man stationed at a piano who played a certain tune when the guard was out looking and the men came up through the bureau. This does sound like a script for Hogan's Heroes. During the whole operation, which took almost 3 months, the Germans did not find how we entered the basement. We had plenty of tools which we had brought from the tradesmen, even to shovels and crowbars. The men worked in hour-long shifts which corresponded with meal hours. When the tunnel was half finished, the air got so bad that the men could not continue. To rectify this, we asked permission to build some rabbit hutches on the grounds, which we knew would be in the same line as the tunnel. These were built, and we punched holes up from the tunnel. We were fortunate that 3 of them came up in the hutches, while others came up in the open, and we built additional hutches over them. Another came up in the guardhouse, which was outside the blockade, but when the men working heard the bar on the wood floor, they suspected something was wrong and stopped. The Germans never found out what this knocking was about, although they heard it. The tunnel was completed, but it wasn't broken through until 3 days later, when 24 prisoners, including myself and 3 naval officers, made our escape. All the other officers were captured within 48 hours and brought back. Our party of 4 had decided beforehand to make our way to the Baltic coast, 47 miles away to the seaport. We reached the coast traveling only at night and hiding in the daytime. We had some difficulty in finding a boat, but eventually found one that was not chained. We had brought a sail with us that we had made in the camp. The cloth was bought from the tradesman. It was fortunate that we took this precaution because the boat we found had neither sails nor oars in it. We set sail to the island Bornholm at dawn. This is a Danish island, and we thought if we could get there, we would be free. Instead of that, just before dawn, we saw a patrol boat coming towards us. There turned out to be a German patrol watching a minefield which we were right over. The Germans told us that we had no business there. We were landed back in Germany, and after being interrogated for several days, we were sent back to the camp at Augustabad. On the 11th of November, 1918, all restraint was thrown to the winds. We were allowed to go into the town and do whatever we liked. On December 1st, a Dutch train came for us and took us to Denmark, where we spent several days in a hospital and finally took a ship back to England. I arrived home at Wallasey, Cheshire on the 19th of December, 1918, 2.5 years after I left Portsmouth for a 5-month voyage. So there you have it. After the war, he proceeded to live a much more normal life for a sea captain. Basically, their family moved, as I said earlier, to New York in 1920 when United Fruit Company, the company that he worked for, moved their base of operations from Liverpool to New York. My mother was 7 years old when that happened in 1920, and she and her siblings grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn. And then the inevitable American dream happened. They all moved out to Long Island, or some moved to California, New Jersey, and today all of the 5 siblings have died, and most of our family involvement is now rested in the cousins. So my major memory is through stories and that I was told by my parents, my mother, but also this wonderful document, which in fact I have added the complete video of me reading that document, as well as a transcript that will appear below the second video of the actual words of that document. So my grandfather was, again, this sort of a standard that everybody heard about, and it was hard to relate to, actually, for me, until I actually read the words of this account of the years 1914 to 1918. And so that's one of the major benefits of this little project, is I got to know my grandfather a little better. And thank you for listening.